I've spent a lot of my career recently working in developer relations, and a lot of folks in DevRel be like, business doesn't understand DevRel. And I've come to the conclusion that it's the opposite problem. And the problem is DevRel doesn't understand business. And I'm not, slamming on developer relations people. That's me. DevRels are the only place. And if you talk to anybody else in any other kind of job and said, I don't feel like I should show the business value of what I do, they would say, what?
All right, folks, strap into your X-Wings and power up those hyperdrives because it's time. With me is my co-host, Yvonne Sharp. She is a cloud DevOps Jedi who's been battling the dark side of downtime and latency across the galaxy for ages. When she's not wielding her lightsaber of automation or force pushing deployments to the cloud, she's keeping the rebellion, or at least the servers running the rebellion, running smoother than a freshly waxed Millennium Falcon. Yvonne, they say the Force is strong with you. I know the Force is strong with you. But I say it's the puns that keep us skywalking. How's it going today?
Let's just say I'm daily battling with the powers of the dark side. Trying to balance the pull of the challenges of leadership with the forces of the rebellion out there actually doing the real work. So trying to ride the line.
Yep. With us, we have a pretty special guest, one that I probably don't need to introduce. Pretty well known in the especially the community circles that I frequent in. But Matty Stratton, welcome to the show. How's it going?
It's good. Glad that it's, nobody ever wants to talk about the weather, but in Chicago, when it gets a little bit warmer, that's all we want to talk about. So it's 50 degrees out, which means we should be running around in shorts and tank tops, I guess.
Yeah. That makes everybody happy. So we're not too far from Chicago, 4 hours, and the snow is almost completely melted around my house, which is very exciting. We were just talking about this. I've slipped probably 4 or 5 times this year. Usually I'm extremely careful and I never slip on ice or snow. This has not been my year, but glad to see the snow gone. So the Windy City, do you, I always ask this, I don't know why, but whenever I'm in Chicago, I always go to Lou's. I love that place. Do you like the Chicago style pizza?
I have strong opinions about this. This is actually, one of the things that, people like, I don't want to say give me a hard time about, but so I don't mind the deep dish, but the secret of Chicago is that we only eat deep dish when y'all come to visit. Real Chicago pizza is a style called tavern style.
That's the second time we've heard this on the podcast.
I guarantee you said you had Tim Banks on the show. I bet he talked about this because he loves to give me a hard time about this. But yeah, tavern style is it's a thin crust and it's party cut, which means in squares. And the reason it's called tavern style is they used to be, so at the bars and, folks would come off their shift and they go to the bar right after. They get these little slices of pizza on a napkin. So it's sort of like pizza tapas or whatever, so you could drink more. So that's the tavern style. And again, I'll do deep dish once a year. We actually have a tradition with DevOps Days Chicago, when people come in and, sort of unofficial after event speaker dinner is we'll go to Lou's or, Giordano's or wherever. And you get that. But also, you couldn't possibly eat that regularly anyway, you would die.
Even eating it once, honestly, I think the last time I was in Chicago, we did Giordano's.
Yeah.
And it's so good. And I hadn't eaten all day. So it was I flew in, it was straight to the office, straight with customers and all this other stuff. And then it was later that evening, I was starving. We go to Giordano's and I overeat. It's so good. You just keep eating. And then you almost need a vacation because you just feel so,
it just
you just,
oh, yeah.
Oh, it's terrible. And then the next day you wake up and it's equally hard. So, yeah. So, you've been a huge just advocate for DevOps for so long, and modernizing enterprise IT practices. I think you co-authored a book about developing apps in the cloud, and you co-host Arrested DevOps, which is an awesome podcast. For those listening, if you have not tuned into Arrested DevOps, it's great. So what else are you working on these days?
Yeah, so like I said, I started ADO a little over 10 years ago. I always say we're the longest running DevOps podcast, still running. I'm using that term a little bit loosely. I'm a little behind in publishing, but I also like to say we're always at the top of all the lists of DevOps podcasts, and maybe that's because we start with an A. I don't know. I like to prefer it the other way. I also, I started DevOps Day Chicago over 10 years ago. We actually have our 10th installment of that coming up in a few short weeks. And I feel like with that event, I love it so much, but I've been trying to step away from it because it's a lot. And I feel like, Michael Corleone in The Godfather, where it's like every time you think you're out, um, and heavily involved with DevOps days around the world. And, yeah, right now, just sort of trying to figure out what my next professional thing is. But I've been involved in lots of different types of work within that space. A lot of the places I've been, I always like to say, I spent 2 decades working in technology operations, and now they pay me to talk about it. Um, so a little over 10 years ago is when I moved over from the vendor side after how many years of working in technology operations and lots of insurance and finance, because Chicago, and when I was running technology operations at apartments.com here in Chicago, it was interesting because I was that time is when I got involved in the DevOps movement early on. But a lot of what we were doing was like, it was like that it's DevOps, but we didn't know what to call it, because, I owned infrastructure, but we were so tightly coupled with app dev. But also, I look back at the things that we've learned over the last 10 plus years, and you think about how you would do work differently. And that's sometimes interesting and sometimes really frustrating, but also I think one of the things is having one of the great things about the kind of roles that I've had over the last decade is I get to see so many different organizations, whether it was working with them directly as, a solution architect or a customer architect, like when I was at Chef, or in developer relations, because I was like, when I was at PagerDuty, I was traveling the world and working with all these different companies, visiting and seeing and talking and hearing, and you see these stories and you see these things, and on one hand you sit there and you're like, we've come so far and this is so great, but then you sit sometimes, it's a cognitive dissonance, right? And then you're like, but we keep having to say the same stuff. There's still lots that has to be done, and I think we've looked at the evolution of, kind of the starry-eyed early dreams, and then, it hits the reality of vendors and marketers. And, and I think about how my, strong opinions have changed because of collision with reality. I'll give a great example. So I was always been a big proponent of, I say DevOps is not a tool, title, or team. It's a way of doing work. I still believe that to be true. And so I would be very noisy about like, oh, there should be no such title as DevOps engineer. That's not a thing. That's like saying you're an agile engineer. That's not a job title. And I've changed my stance on that. I still believe that DevOps is a way of doing work, but I don't publicly make a big deal out of like, oh, it's a terrible title. And there were 2 things that happened that made me rethink that. So one was Ian Coldwater made this point once, and they said, you have to remember that the people who have the title DevOps engineer, that's not a self-bestowed title. Someone else gave them that title. So all you're doing is making them feel bad, and it's not their choice, which I think is a very empathetic way to think about it. The practical way is Pete Cheslock said once, he had done some data research. This was 6 or 7 years, maybe about 6 years ago. And he said, the pay compensation difference between cloud engineer or system administrator and DevOps engineer was about 30% increase. So I was like, cool, call yourself whatever you want. Go get your bag, call yourself the king of France if it's going to get you more money. So, but I still do think that a lot of this is, while org structures are what they are, ultimately a lot of this is just thinking about how we do work, right? You're not going to solve this with, and I think as a community and as a movement, it feels like early on, we over-rotated, or it appeared to over-rotate on culture. If we think about, the acronym CALMS, which is, kind of the prototype of thinking about DevOps, the culture, automation, lean, measurement, and sharing, which I still think applies. And it seems like we really overemphasized, or felt like it was all about the C. And part of the reason, to me, I always thought about it this way, is all of them are equally important, but that's the one you have to convince people about. You don't have to convince engineers to use automation tools. Like they're going to want to do that. Like we want to do those things come a little more naturally, but like the culture part is also one of the hardest parts. Similarly, early on in the movement, there was a very brief and thankfully brief movement attempted to have this idea of enterprise DevOps, which was calms without the C. And there was a person who I won't name, who was a big believer in this, who used to say culture is for yogurt. And was saying, oh, in the enterprise, it's all about getting this work done. And honestly, who saved us from all of that was Gene Kim and DevOps Enterprise Summit, because you had this came up and said, this is enterprise and it's DevOps the way we talk about it. And it kind of shut all that down. That was a really important time.
Well, and I think one of the challenges, and this happens in the trajectory with any ideology, right? So I was introduced to the Phoenix Project very early on, like 2013, right? The book hadn't been out a year yet. It was a shiny new idea. There was all this excitement around it that, like there's this new way to think about things. And then there was Nicole Forsgren's book coming out of Google and Accelerate and all of the things that we've learned there. I think there's a reality to work, though, when these ideas and principles start really hitting the real world and get mainstreamed, that there's just the weight of work and people and processes that gets attached to it over time that dilutes the idea. And I think that's part of where we're at in the evolution of the concepts, is like it was important enough that it did make some changes and that people did make good faith efforts to implement agile development, DevOps principles. But that has come against things like corporate compliance, 100 years of enterprise, culture, especially in organizations that were built in a manufacturing world, right? And so there becomes all this weight associated with the concepts that aren't the core principles, and people start looking for, okay, so what's the next thing?
Yep.
But because it doesn't seem so pure anymore. But really, it's all kind of the same thing. We just reinvented and attached new words to it because we're trying to get rid of the stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. I had an episode of ADO. It was called Platform Engineering Just DevOps with Better Marketing, right? Everything old is new again. I think a couple of things that you said are really key. One thing that was a problem, if you will, is that there was no DevOps manifesto. In fact, DevOps was very not specific, and that was by design. And the problem is people want that. And so when there's a vacuum, that gets filled, right? So it gets filled with, well, then it means this. And the other thing is, like you said, when you run into organizational things, I don't remember the exact idiom, but it's like you will never convince someone, you'll never sell something to someone or convince them when it's contrary to basically how they make a living. And that's what got us safe, right? Scaled Agile framework is how program managers get to still have a job and call it Agile, right? And I think you have to figure out, but the thing is, like you said about, like, as long as you're still getting to the core improvement, and that's the other thing we have to, when we look back, we can be very frustrated and say, oh, it's not what it was. But I remember what it was like. I did this work, right? And this is so much better. And I think there's context that we have to take into account, and we have to look at the larger perspective. Two things come to mind when it comes to that. One was, I remember on my first day at PagerDuty, I was in the new hire onboarding, and a lot of the people in my group were, we'll just say, newer in their career. It was one of their first or second jobs or whatever. And they're sort of in the onboarding, they're telling the story of PagerDuty and like what it first came out to be. And I remember all these people, who were much younger and earlier in their career were like, I don't understand how that was a problem to solve. Like, what do you mean? Like getting the alert to the right person? And I was like, oh, let me tell you stories about having to update Exchange distribution list once a week to whoever was on call. And I'm like, it seems like such a simple little thing, but it was so big.
That's a bless your heart moment, right?
Really,
You're just
a little bit.
sweet summer child,
Yeah.
like.
How fortunate for you that you didn't have to, that this seems like, what's the problem? And the other part, when you think about the context, when I was leaving my role at Chef. And so I had been a pre-sales person, and then I also switched over to on the technical side of success. So I'd work with these organizations at the beginning of their journey, and then once they had started to adopt. And when I was leaving to go to my next role, I kind of had, the last meetings I would have. And I remember in my last week at Chef, I had my quarterly meeting with the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. We're one of my favorite customers here. And I was with them for a long time. And, one of the people on the team said, Matty, I feel like we've let you down. We have not gotten as much done as we should have in the last couple of years. And I said, hang on. Let's take this back. I said, you're in the middle of it and you know what you want. I said, I have the luxury of stepping back, and I'm like, let me remind you, let's go in the Wayback Machine 18 months ago. Look at how much you've done. And oftentimes we don't see that when we're so close to that. And even as an industry, we get frustrated because when our reach should exceed our grasp. But then that means if we're going to have our reach exceed our grasp, we can't beat ourselves up when our reach exceeds our grasp, right? That's the trick of it. And a lot of it, like you said, there's all sorts of reasons, but I still think the net is positive. And we still have a bunch more work to do, and things continue to evolve. The problems we were trying to solve 15 years ago were different than today's problems. Cloud changes things in so many ways. You think about Javon's paradox, right? Like it's the easier it is to do something, the more there is of it. And you think about the scale we talk about that you can do with cloud. And I'm my old school, like rack and stack. I remember, if I wanted a server when I was at the bank, I mean, that was 4 months, to get that done. And the idea like, even virtualization, like when we rolled in, VMware, it was like, what do you mean? It's just like press this button and now I have a server. You don't get things that fast. And that comes with its other problems.
Well,
maybe,
and as we
need to go back to some of those old rack and stack days because maybe we're a little more thoughtful. I don't know, but
Well, and as we look forward, there are going to be new challenges with, AI and inference, and there are new problems associated with that technology and new scale that we're going to have to solve. There's a whole arena of AI ML ops that's virginal, right? We've got all of these models all over the place that are doing all the things. We need them all to be orchestrated and working together and have kind of the same training and the same back end. But we also need them close to the users. How are we going to operationalize that whole process in a world where there are new problems? So there are fresh horizons out there that the progress we've made in the last 10 to 15 years is going to provide the platform that we build on in the next decade. And that's a whole new set of operational problems that the technology is still maturing into that I see coming.
And speaking of hardware, there's an investment in hardware again to run this stuff locally in the data centers that, some of these companies didn't get rid of all their data centers and put everything in cloud. Thank goodness, because there's a balance here. And it turns out running some of this stuff against smaller subsets of data and figuring things out before maybe you put it in the cloud is so much cheaper that it is a no-brainer.
Well, I was going to say, with Yvonne, like you're saying, as we move to these next things, we build on the shoulders of giants, learn our lessons, and the core, while the implementation detail will differ, but those core, I wouldn't even necessarily say first principles, but it all comes down to these are socio-technical systems, and what has not changed is the socio part of it. And as I say, computers are easy, people are hard. Right. We will learn the new technology, but there's changes to the socio part of the socio-technical because the tendrils of all the LLMs, like we used to, separation was easy before to a certain point. We could argue about it. We could sit there and say maybe some things were too separated, but it was like this data was here for the most part. Yeah, you can distribute it, you can do whatever, but now you're sort of like, as your LLMs and everything are kind of reaching into all of these things. It's like, how do you have that traceability? How do you have that? And then what I think the important part is, and this goes back to something you said early on, Yvonne, is that like when you sort of hit, we can't just keep doing things the same way because our worlds continue to change. So what we need to do is say, what can we take from how we've done it? How do we apply it? But, we've always done it that way. It doesn't work, right? What got you there is not, what got you here is not going to get you there. And it's hard because so many things that we've done, and especially, and you talk about bigger organizations and people have things they've built, and it's, you have to, anytime I was working with anybody in transformation or any kind of a change, one of the first things I say, every decision you've made up till right now has been the exact right decision, right? None of this is because you want to, we do it this way because that's how we do it. It's like, fine, cool. Things are different now. We have to, we look in the rearview mirror, but we're going forward. So what does need to change? Because, and how often do we have things that exist? I mean, we could do a whole episode of war stories about weird processes that exist because of one wacky thing that happened once. There's a couple that I always think about. I remember when I started at apartments.com. So we had, the backend database cluster, we had all the front end databases that serve the website. And, we would do releases and distributions. And I was like, why does it take an hour for data to replicate from the back end to the front end? And it was because it would hit each front end server with 10 minutes in between. And the reason was because one time someone pushed out a jacked up change and it took down all the front end data. So now to be safe, we do this. And it was like, well, and again, I didn't know as much of that as I did now. Now I would know a little bit more how to frame it, but you're like, again, this goes back to what do we build in the system to keep that from happening? Because what we've done is we made every single release take way longer than it has to. Or there's a great story, and I every year this becomes less and less likely to still be true. But in 2005, Mozilla, there was a change made to Firefox, and it broke MLB.com. And this change was pushed out on day one of the World Series. So for years, as long as I knew, there was a smoke test in Firefox that was test MLB.com. Now those are okay because those are just, they exist. They're not part of they don't slow you down. They're not part of this. But how much do we have? It's also the other side, and the socio part of the socio-technical. One of my friends used to say, never be the reason a policy is created. But so many of the ways we work are built around things that may no longer be relevant, but they're in our operational DNA. And we do need to pull them. It is important to look back and to say, why do we do this? But it's not from that's wrong. It's just more like, let's understand it. But none of this is, the way you've been working has been wrong and you're bad. It's just like, with the information you had and the world the way it was at the time, that was the right decision. Things change, but let's adjust.
I gave an internal talk just a week or so ago where we were unpacking these things. Let's understand an organization and where they come from. What was their mission statement? What are they in the world to do and accomplish? And what they're in the world to do and accomplish shapes not just their product, but who they are as an organization. And in order to impact change at that organization, you have to understand those things. I feel like sometimes we have to become almost an organizational forensic archaeologist and unpack some of those things and say, this is why this thing exists. Now, let's talk about what's new and different now that gives us permission to change that thing, right? Because a lot of people don't understand that, and people have different fear and risk thresholds. And some folks are like, burn it all down. I don't care. Like, we'll just go make it all new. There's value in that kind of mentality. But then there are also people that like, these things exist for a reason and we might break something if we change it. And you need both of those mentalities to come together and solve the problem and determine what the way forward is. And we also have to be patient with one another through that process, right?
If things don't turn on a dime. People ask me, they say, what's the most important DevOps book I should read? And I say, go read Freakonomics, understand incentives, and you can do DevOps, right? And if it comes back to, I think about like PagerDuty, and I would teach these workshops on incident response and incident command. And one of the things we would teach is say during an incident, one of the things is we'd say, don't litigate severity, which means during the incident. It's not, oh, is it really it came in as a Sev 1, maybe it's really a Sev 2, blah, blah, blah. So, and I would constantly have folks who come on and say, we do this all the time. This happens all the time. And I said, I bet that you have an executive that measures success by how many Sev 1 incidents exist. And they're like, yep. And I'm like, so there you go, right? So that's the thing. So why we say then the most important metric on a team then is not mean time to resolution. It's mean time to innocence, right? How quickly can you prove that you didn't break it? It wasn't a Sev 1. And none of that serves restoring service or getting the stuff done. And this goes all into, you talked about Dr. Forsgren, and, she's a big believer and leverages the Western model so much, right? And it's kind of funny because my fiance, works for a small business, and she's having some not in tech, and I think she's an operations manager for a heating and air place. And I told her about the Western model the other day, because talking about things, it happens in a company of 20 people. I'm like, pathological. And she's like, yep, that's because I was like, it was funny. She's describing certain things, and I was like, oh, these are literally in the Western. So it happens, and those are the hardest things. The technology is easy. We figure that out because it does what we say. It acts the way we expect it to, mostly. And if it doesn't, our expectation was probably wrong. People don't. Although, if you kind of understand how people work, doesn't mean you can manipulate them. Doesn't mean that you'll always get it right. But if you know what's important to them, I have an old talk called The 5 Love Languages of DevOps, and it's fundamentally about change. And it's I think it comes to mind with anything when you're trying to affect change, because the thing that resonates to you about why this thing is important is not going to be the same as the person you're trying to convince. And I had a fellow who was on my podcast early on, and he's not a tech person. He's actually a leadership coach, and he's the one I got all my management training from. And I've told him, I was talking to him recently, and I said, Bill, you don't understand how many large organizations have heard your name when I'm talking about DevOps. Because he talks about committed versus compliant people in a change, and that's a different conversation. But also, he's like, if you're trying to convince somebody of something and you find yourself saying, William just doesn't get it, that's on you. That's not William, right? I'm not speaking your language. And, the thing that resonates to me is maybe as the system engineer is like, okay, if we have all this much better automation, this is easier, whatever. Well, you're maybe on the finance side of it, so you're going to resonate more with the reliability, different. You have to understand the drivers of the people you're trying to make change with, and it feels like falling on deaf ears. And I've also, I've spent a lot of my career recently working in developer relations, and I came to this conclusion over the last year or so, because a lot of folks in DevRel will be like, oh, the business just doesn't understand what DevRel does. They don't understand why we're about. The business doesn't understand DevRel. And I've come to the conclusion that it's the opposite problem. And the problem is DevRel doesn't understand business, right? Ooh. It's like, and this is true for, it's funny because I'm not slamming on developer relations people. That's me. But DevRels are the only place. And if you talk to anybody else in any other kind of job and said, I don't feel like I should show the business value of what I do, they would say, what? And the only other people who would say that are software engineers, by the way. Guilty from, the new kingmakers, like, screwed the whole thing up, right? We got into this whole, I remember early on in Arrested DevOps, we had someone on, and she said the value of DevOps was that it protected the time of your most valuable people in your organization, your developers. And I was like, I want to be like, get off my show. Right. That's not what this is at all. But, and yeah, that kind of.
You're giving me so many one-liners for shorts, video shorts that I can make just out of that sort of blurb right there. So I'm loving this back and forth between you two. Like, I'm loving this. It's almost like I'm in the audience right now, and I'm loving every second of it. I want to propose something, and I want to hear you both talk about it now. So one thing that I've noticed in the past, like, it's really become real to me, like, over the past 2 years, is I used to think that, like, organization or team size didn't matter so much. Like, it wasn't that big of a deal. And something I realized when I went from, like, large enterprise to startup is I've seen, like, small teams scale huge things, but I've also seen, like, the more hands you have in that cookie jar, for some reason or another, tends to slow things down. So, like, when I worked in enterprise, there would be this thing where they would say, okay, we're just going to hire an army of DevOps people and we're going to pair you up and we're going to hire a partner to come in. Give it a steroid injection. You have 40 people at your disposal. We'll taper them off. And the more people that we threw into these big initiatives, the slower, the more complicated. Like, it would completely nerf the whole, it would be a waste of money, pretty much. Like, light your money on fire. But even in the startup space, like having like a very small agile team, like the Amazon, 2 pizza box thing was like a really sweet spot if you did it right. And then as you start injecting more people and more opinions, you find that it starts becoming problematic. And I don't really even know at this point how to think about this problem. Like, does team size matter? What does it mean?
Well, the first problem with the 2 pizza team thing is that I'm a 2 pizza team. I can eat 2 pizzas by myself. So, it's all relative. But I don't think there's like a magic number, right? There's not this magic number, like at this size, it's too big. But you're 100% right, because just even think about if you've got, how hard is it to figure out where to go for dinner if you're deciding between 4 people or a dozen people? There's more opinions. I like to think about ways that you can leverage, and a lot of it, the size of the team you can handle to be able to move quickly depends a lot on how that team works and what your organizational culture is. Because if you have high levels of psychological safety, that team can be bigger. Now, that being said, the bigger the team, the harder psychological safety is, because you're mixing more ways of thinking, so getting alignment, but you get too small, you get too aligned, and then you don't have any voices of dissent. You don't have any other pieces of that. I think you have to, if you want to be able to make a larger team work better, you have to have a little more rigor that you can abandon when you come to how you do things, right? You can say, we have a certain amount. You have to be able to say, we will bike shed on this only so long, but eventually a decision has to be made, right? I like to think about voice but no vote sometimes in certain types of decisions where we're like, I want to hear what everybody has to say, but ultimately this is decided by these 2 people. Because if it's complete, again, the consensus protocol, right? The bigger, the more people, the harder it is to get to consensus. And I think there's lessons you can learn, and also how you rotate that, because what you don't want to do is have the same people always be the vote people, and the same people are the voice people. But maybe you say, okay, for this one, at the end of the day, the buck stops with Yvonne and William. We want to hear from everybody. Okay, but the next time, maybe it's not the next time, but you have different ways you could structure it. Okay, this is your place where you make the ultimate decision, but you can bring, so the bigger the team, the harder it is to do it. But I think just to say, well, then we'll just do a really small team, you lose something from that, because now you're going to get way more homogenous, because even if you don't enter that team that way, that will tend to happen over the course of, 4 or 5 people are going to tend to bloop. Eventually, This is how we do this part of that. So part of it is also maybe even just smaller teams that are more ephemeral as well. Like, that's the one to think about it too, is like, you can have a bigger team on the thing, but you're like, for this problem, we have this squad that exists. It comes up to do this, and then it's done. And next time it's a different squad. So that way, if we have to make fast decisions, we can do that, but we're not always the same people making the decisions, and we're able to distribute it and bring that in.
I love that. So you're basically saying, one more thing, Yvonne, sorry.
Go ahead.
So you're saying basically, like, instead of like decision by committee, like that you would see at a large company, you basically have the few people that are like in charge of this one thing. And yeah, they're going to take feedback from all sorts of different sources, but whether they use that feedback, they're just using it to inform their decision, but they get that final decision.
The buck has to stop somewhere, because otherwise you get into analysis paralysis. Same thing happens in incident response. That's why you have to have if you think about it in the proper incident command system, the incident commander, whoever that happens to be in a proper incident command system, it's a different person all the time. They outrank everybody on the call, even the CEO, because someone's got to be able to be like, this is the decision, because the wrong decision is better than no decision, right? Oftentimes. So. But I think you have to distribute that, though. Similar, like in incident command, it can't always be the same people that are the decision makers, even around the same thing, because people will eventually turn into, then why am I even involved? Because all I am is an opinion. But if it's like, hey, and again, I wouldn't necessarily say you'd structure it that it changes every week. I'm using this as an analog, but it's like, okay, well, it's not my turn this week, but I know I'll get my turn. And that also, if you eventually, and then also brings in that making the decisions is hard.
What do you think about it?
Well, there's so much. I mean, because there's team size, and I do think like beyond a certain size for particular tasks, like just teams don't work once you get past a certain size if they're all working together on a discrete task, and in my mind that's somewhere around 10 or 15. At the same time, you've got organization size, which is a completely different thing because here's the thing, the bigger organization, the more discrete teams you need, and then you've got to figure out how are all those teams going to coordinate with one another and work together. And when you start with a very small company, it's a non-problem because, and I think what we know is that a group can really only ever be as big as around 150 people.
Yeah.
Like that's how many people we can know well and keep track of. In a startup, that's perfect. But once you start growing to thousands or tens of thousands of people, you need a certain degree of organizational scaffolding to make all that work. And the analogy that I use is like if you're building a single family home, that can be framed up with wood, with lumber. But eventually, if you're building a multi-story apartment complex, you've got to have some steel underneath to keep that thing from collapsing in on itself. And then the question becomes, how much scaffolding do you need? And then how much room do you need to give these teams the ability to bend and flex to be able to work together? And it's actually a very difficult problem because depending on the organization, depending on its mission, depending on its culture, depending on its skill level, that's going to look different. But I think I think that the team problem is one problem, but then part of your question, William, was like organizational size. And that's a completely different thing because at some point an organization has to scale beyond like we just hire smart people and let them do their thing. Okay. But if you have 5 smart people all working on the same thing in different ways, then you're working against yourself, right? So it's a much bigger, more complex problem than a lot of times we want to give it credit for. It seems like it should be simple. It is not simple.
To take an analogy that's probably going to fall apart halfway through it, but it's kind of like, when you're talking about like in that start of that small team, when it's like, hey, we got this small, that's a monolith. And there's great things about a monolith, right? You can move fast with that because there's one thing or whatever. But then as you distribute out, so the larger organization, that's your microservice. So if you're going to have a microservices architecture, there's a whole lot of different kinds of not just technical, but just procedural infrastructure you have to have in place. And you have to have well-defined APIs, right? Where that comes in. And I've really pushed that metaphor in maybe terrible ways before, but teaching my team in my last role, I'd say you have to learn the marketing API. You have to learn the sales API. Like, how do you communicate? And I have a talk I gave, I just forgot the name of it. I'll get to it in a second. Oh, it said, zero trust is for networks, not for teams. But it's kind of this idea of that if you think about a service-oriented architecture, it's like what happens inside the team is the black box, but you can only do that when same thing with the server. Like nobody cares how that service executes as long as its contract is fulfilled. So if you say, this is how we work with the larger part of that, and we agree to that, nobody cares how you do it inside there, so to speak. It's like, that's fine because this thing goes in, I get this result. That's the thing that happens. And that's so, but just like we said, the advantage of a monolith is you got one repo, you got one thing, it's easy, it's fine, but so you can't just suddenly say we're going from a monolith to microservices, but we're not going to build all the right things in place to let these services.
We're not going to have a service mesh. We're not going to have a contract. Yeah.
That's a great analogy. That didn't fall apart at all. It's perfect. Great thought exercise. So I know one thing in listening to Arrested DevOps here the past few months on and off, whenever I can, there's so much good content out there. It's crazy. Platform engineering is one of those things that's sort of crept up. It's almost like the new and the new and shiny thing. And I remember in enterprise, like you mentioned SAFe earlier, which made me cringe because I worked for a large Fortune 50 that went all in with SAFe, straight from waterfall. Like we didn't even know what was happening at the time. And they came in and, we had next thing we knew, we had scrum masters, we had program managers, we had project managers, we had product owners. We had more people doing process than actually doing technical work.
Safe
And it
is
was-
all the ritual and none of the result, right?
It was so hard. So do you think platform engineering is like is it really a new idea at this point?
No, and I don't think so. And I don't mean that in any kind of a dismissive way. That's actually the good thing. It's we're in a position that it's interesting when you see things and you're like, we've actually wanted to do this for so long and we were not capable because the technology was different, the places were different. I think, it's James Governor said, everyone's just out there trying to replicate Heroku. And if you think about it, this was the idea, right? You think about, I've been talking about for years about treating your platform, treating your infrastructure as a product internally. And that's real. I almost said real platform engineering here. Now I'm going to be this purist, but if you kind of look at platform engineering from that perspective and the places that do it successfully, that's exactly how that works, right? It is this platform that we build is an internal product and we have to treat it like a product. In terms of we have customers that have to use it. So there has to be, so DX matters, right? Giving the features that are, whether your customers are the one that's directly or indirectly giving you money. And I think that's something that has been sorely needed on the infrastructure side. And we haven't really been in a good way to do that. I think there's also just like, well, I'm going to DevOps. I'm just going to, throw some Terraform at stuff. And now I'm DevOps, right? There's a lot of, platform engineering isn't just like go install Backstage and now you're a platform engineer, right? It is a modality. It's a way of working. And I think it is an evolution of some of the things we talked about in DevOps. I think they're very closely aligned. I think if you espouse platform engineering principles, DevOps as a principle and a way of working, it's easier. Right. And also, I think where it came out of was a little bit like Yvonne's point very early on, which said, okay, you can have these ideas and they work. And then you start to hit certain types of scale. And, Michael Ducey used to say, silos are good, right? Like silos keep things from blowing up a lot of times on farms, right? Like there are reasons we have these things, but for them to work well, they have to be friendly silos. And the models of platform engineering allow for that. This says we can have, because the scale is so big that it can't just be everybody does everything. We just sort of talked about this in the team side, but you have the way that it's like serving the right thing versus, so it's not kind of the wall of confusion stuff that Andrew Schaefer would talk about when you're talking about interacting with a platform team, because you're interacting with it like a product, not just like, oh, here you go, and you can kind of take some of those or part of the socio-technical and kind of codify it and productize it a little bit. I think that's where but just like every other time we've tried to make things better in this industry, people, I'm giving you all the things. One of my favorite little off the cuff ones is you can't buy DevOps, but I sure can sell it to you.
Well, and one of the unfortunate side effects of the DevOps movement was that there was this mentality that grew out of it that like your developers could do the ops and they could do all the things, right? And so it was this bastard.
DevOps is the dumbest word. It should not have been called that, and Schaefer will tell you that. Yeah.
It was a bastardization of that ideology, right? And so I think what platform engineering is doing is coming back and saying, okay, the platform is a thing that developers need, and we need people who specialize in maintaining that platform and delivering it, right? Because what we whitewashed away as we started talking about DevOps is that very important job of the operations people and the folks who maintain all the things that everybody needs to work. Because what the bean counters heard was,
you need fewer people. Yeah.
it's the full stack engineer. We just need fewer, better people, right?
Yep.
And it's kind of like that's not how any of this works, right? So I feel like platform engineering is a pushback at that idea.
I agree. I think that's really well put. It's Charity Majors said this too. It's like ops is a skill. right? You can't just, and it's funny because there's, this happens, and a lot of this is human and organizationally human. I remember I had a friend I worked with many, many years ago when I was a webmaster. That'll date the conversation in the first place, but it was for a computer catalog company. And, so I worked very closely with the person who did design, the graphic designer who did the catalog. And she would say, like, people come and be like, hey, Tammy, can you teach me Photoshop this afternoon? And it's like this diminishing of what you do into like, well, it must be easy. I can just do it. The only reason I don't do it is I don't want to. And that was a lot of that, to your point, of a lot of that was, okay, well, if we just teach the devs and then they can do what that was, we're like, no, we're not saying that. We're not saying everybody, it's just one persona. What we're saying is break down the walls. Like, devs should be thinking about how this will be operationalized, but not they do it. And the same thing. And we the same damn thing happened with shift left, right? Like, the idea of shifting security left was not get rid of the security people and make all the security be done. That we're just saying, move some of the thinking about that earlier in the process, right? But you still have to have, you can still have software engineers thinking about testing and thinking about security and stuff, but that doesn't mean you don't have security people. It doesn't, but it means that we're just sort of making it more holistic, and that's harder to sell, like you said, because same thing is, how many things have been misinterpreted as this will save you money? And if that's cloud, if your thought was cloud was going to save you money, you're doing it wrong. All cloud did was move CapEx to OpEx, right? There's no magic thing. Automation is not a headcount reduction exercise. Automation is a reprioritizing of effort exercise. It's getting more value out of the people that you have, but it's not like, oh, cool, we'll bring in Puppet and now we can fire all the sysadmins. You're like, no, but that's appealing. So that's a really good way to think about it, is that, yeah, platform engineering, I agree with you 100% that's a way of saying, okay, we can have it in this way, but you still have this domain expertise that has to reason about that. And it doesn't work. It doesn't scale one-to-one. And I think that's why you need to have that, because you are always going to have more developers than ops for lots of reasons. And so I remember at apartments.com when we took on Agile, it was, the idea was, okay, so now we moved into these different Agile teams and we said, okay, we want to get sysadmin like integrated. So we said, okay, cool. So there would be on every feature team, the team was made up, there were the testers and there was the scrum master and all the developers and then there was the sysadmin. There were like 7 feature teams. I had 3 sysadmins, which meant everybody was on multiple teams. And we actually hit a point with the rituals where my team came to me and they said, do the math. Let's do the math. I literally have no time to actually do any work because my entire day is taken up by Agile ritual, because I go to 3 stand-ups a day, 3 sprint reviews every time, and all of this stuff, because you're never it doesn't scale organizationally. So you kind of build those. And that's where I'm saying where everything old is new again, because that's how you would approach it from infrastructure. You said, okay, well, there was infrastructure as a service, different kind of as a service than cloud type thing. We said you consume it because we have to be able to scale behind it, but that created a really big wall. And I think at least with PlatEng, we are better equipped to be able to treat it in the way that we can use a lot of those great things. But I'm going to remember what you said about it being a pushback to that. I think that's spot on.
This was I think we need to start wrapping it up at some point. This has been an amazing conversation. It makes me, so we were supposed to have Tim Banks on at some point in the future. We should have both of you on and do a future of platform engineering or the future of DevOps. One of those sort of roundtable things. I think having both of your personalities in here at the same time would be a riot.
It might be a multi-episode conversation. We might have to chunk it up into series.
Yeah, that'd be
great.
I
was thinking, William, when you were talking about the one-liners for the shorts, I started early on in Arrested DevOps just sort of randomly doing cold opens where I would, just pull a quote kind of out of context and throw it before the opening music. And then we had my podcast co-host, her husband was doing our audio editing for me. And my favorite thing when I would get the edit back from him, I'm like, oh, I wonder what Joe's going to pull out for the cold open, and it was always, and then sometimes you sit there and then as you're doing the episode, you're like, all right, yep, Yvonne just said it. That's the one.
So you gotta keep things entertaining, gotta keep it fresh, gotta, throw some curveballs in there, right? Yeah.
We're all about the
Um,
one-liners and platitudes.
Yeah.
here.
And I wasn't gonna ask this before. I have to know. So I was presenting it. It was AWS Community Day like 2 years ago. It was in Chicago, and I'm pretty sure I met you there.
I bet.
Tim Banks was there as well.
Valtieri runs that. She did DevOps Days Chicago with me many years. Tim Banks was actually at that one too.
Yeah.
Which I didn't realize, and that was part of what. Yeah, and it was one of the. I think when I came, it was a very like last minute, like, oh, I don't have anything going on today. Let me come in and hang out. But I think you're right. Yeah, that was crazy when you said. I would be like, it wasn't 2 years ago. It was. I'm like, no, it probably was 3 years ago.
It was in the Morningstar building. It was that month.
Yep. 100%.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah. Hey, I know that. I remember that part.
Yeah. It was very nice. Okay. That's good. And so one thing too, you motivate me. So I've been on like sort of kind of like in between X and Blue Sky at this point, and you're no shame. You're posting those leg day updates, and leg days are like the worst days for me. I've hated them forever since I was in high school, but I'm starting to love them as I get older because I've had these. So I play competitive ice hockey. That's my one hobby. And I've had these hip issues over the years, and like doing legs the right way and starting to build up that strength with hip, core, glutes, and all that has been a life changer for me because I sit so much. That's a problem.
Very, not to go into the whole thing, but it was like what turned it around with me is I started like, I was sort of messing around with programming when I was starting to lift. I did like, oh, I'll do a PP, I'll do whatever, I'll do a leg day. And then I did a couple months where I did the 5x5, and 5x5 is every day is squats. And that was that's really what pushed my squats way up, is I was doing them 3 days, and I don't do that anymore. But like, yeah, it's
you're doing squats 3 days a week.
I can tell the difference for myself, just how I'm getting older. And that's a big part of doing this, is you get around differently. You feel more comfortable doing certain things, and they're not fun, but then they become a little fun, because then you're like, okay, and
when you see the gains and you see the benefits, that is when it's like real, and you're like, you will suffer through it, wake up early, do whatever you have to do. But like, how often do you do legs, out of curiosity?
Well, I mean, so I do, it's funny too, because I was just about to change my program, and I'm like, no, I'm going to stick with it. So I do a 4-day. So I'm doing something with legs every day. So it's either my main lift or my second lift. So it's either, so like on one day, like for example, today I'll do my heavy lift will be squats, and my secondary lift will be bench press. So like more reps, but less weight. And then tomorrow it's going to be overhead press is my main lift, and then deadlift for volume. And then on Thursday, it will be bench for volume. And then I do Bulgarians because they're terrible, and I hate myself, but there's still a squat. And then on Friday, I'll do deadlift heavy and overhead lighter. So there's something posterior chain every day. And that also makes it, because the same thing, if you have quote unquote leg day, then you can hate leg day. But if every day is leg day somehow, but I also like doing it that way, because there's other variants I've done where instead of splitting them up, it would be like the 5-3-1. It could be like, okay, you do heavy squats and then you do lighter ones, and you do that all in the same day. I'm like, I like to mix them up, because then it's not like, then you also don't have that day. It's like you do something different. And I told my son, my 15-year-old son, he started lifting with me at the beginning of the school year. Now he's doing it for baseball, and he would talk about, and he sees all this stuff on YouTube, and he's like, all this stuff. And I said, Joey, we are novice lifters. I said, again, I've been doing this for a year, and I'm still a massive beginner with a lot of stuff, since I was doing it however long ago. And I'm like, it doesn't matter what we do. The only reason to have a program is to make it interesting. Like you have to be like so far when it's like, how do I optimize and make sure I'm doing exactly the right thing? It's just like, fundamentally, the best way to get gains is just like, do something with intentionality all the time. Or often.
Show up and make yourself sweat.
Do it, right? Discipline over motivation. So,
love that.
But it's fun stuff. So
awesome. Well, it's been great having you on the show. We've got to do this again with Tim.
Yeah,
it would be awesome. Where can folks find you? Got to ask.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Where can you find? I mean, this is the bizarre thing. You can find me on LinkedIn is a thing I never really would have thought, but I was talking to someone recently about how all the tech content is over on LinkedIn. You can find me at Blue Sky. I'm Matty.WTF on Blue Sky. Just look up Matty Stratton on LinkedIn. Those are probably the main things. Follow Arrested DevOps. We'll get some more episodes out of there. I'm excited. Just having this conversation, I'm like, all right, you got a podcast again. Although it's way more fun. Like maybe we'll get you guys to come on my show, because being a guest on a podcast is even more fun because you just show up and talk. You know, what people listening don't understand is, William especially, you guys are sitting back there going, okay, what's the time? And okay, got to wrap up this part or whatever. And then you come on and you just run your mouth. So we'll do a crossover episode. It'll be great.
Yeah.